Chapter 14, The City of Lost Names and the Keeper's Paradox. Twilight descended on Meridian Avenue like a gentle benediction, painting the familiar streets in shades of violet and gold that made everything seem slightly unreal, as if the approaching darkness was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of possibility waiting to be discovered. The five seekers walked together through neighborhoods they had traversed countless times before, but tonight their footsteps echoed with the weight of anticipation, each stride carrying them deeper into territories that existed not on any city map, but in the spaces between what was known and what was waiting to be remembered. Maya felt her consciousness harmonizer humming softly in her hands, producing frequencies that seemed to call forth responses from unexpected directions, not sounds she could identify, but resonances that suggested music was being made by the city itself, compositions that incorporated the rhythm of their footsteps, the whisper of evening wind through narrow alleys, the distant conversations of people whose words they couldn't quite distinguish, but whose emotional tones carried clearly through the gathering darkness. Joe carried his intentional nourishment facilitators with the careful intention of someone transporting precious cargo, sensing that the objects had somehow become more than tools. They pulsed with a life of their own, responding to his emotional state and the quality of attention that he brought to each moment. When he paused to shift his grip, warm light emanated from the devices as if they were eager to serve purposes he had not yet learned to imagine. Elena walked with her consciousness matter interface detector active, studying energy patterns that swirled through the urban atmosphere with increasing complexity as they moved away from the commercial districts and into residential areas where the boundaries between public and private space became more fluid. Her readings suggested they were approaching locations where the usual laws of physics operated according to modified parameters, places where consciousness and matter interacted in ways her scientific training had never taught her to recognize. Leo's multidimensional creative manifestation tools seemed to be creating artworks of their own accord, generating three-dimensional sketches in the air around him that captured not just the visual elements of their journey, but the quality of transformation that was occurring with each step they took away from their familiar territory and toward destinations that existed beyond the reach of conventional navigation. Tariq's consciousness integration humor facilitators produced sounds that were simultaneously laughter and music, creating atmospheric effects that made their entire group feel lighter, more buoyant, as if joy itself was lifting them slightly above the ordinary gravitational pull of everyday concerns and conventional limitations. The stranger led them through a sequence of turns that seemed choreographed by intelligence that understood not just the physical geography of the city, but the psychological territories they needed to traverse in order to arrive at their destination in the proper state of consciousness. Each alley they entered felt more removed from the ordinary reality of the last until they found themselves walking through spaces that seemed to exist in the margins of urban landscape. Places that might have been invisible to anyone not specifically seeking the kind of transformation they were pursuing. The threshold of unnamed territories. When they finally paused before the narrow archway that seemed to have been carved from crystallized moonlight, Maya felt a flutter of recognition mixed with apprehension. The arch bore no inscription, no identifying markers, no indication of what lay beyond its shadowed opening. Yet something in her consciousness knew that they had arrived at the threshold that would forever divide their experience into before and after, into who they had been and who they were about to become. The city of lost names, the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that made the archway itself seem to vibrate in response. It exists in the spaces between designation and reality, between who you think you are and who you might become if you were willing to release your attachment to particular definitions of identity. Lady Amara materialized from shadows that seemed to have been waiting for her arrival, her presence adding layers of depth and complexity to the atmospheric changes that they had been experiencing throughout their journey. Her usual silver hair had taken on hues that shifted between moonlight and starfire. Her robes seemed to be woven from the essence of twilight itself. Every human being, she explained as they prepared to cross the threshold, carries with themselves multiple identities that remain unexplored because they have become too attached to particular names, roles, and self-definitions. What lies beyond this archway provides opportunities to experience these unexplored aspects of selfhood by temporarily releasing the designations that usually constrain identity within familiar boundaries. Elena activated her consciousness matter interface detector, studying the energy patterns that swirled around the archway with increasing intensity. The readings suggested they were approaching a space where the relationship between names and realities had become fluid, where the act of designation itself could be consciously modified through directed attention and intentional choice. You're describing a location where identity becomes experimental rather than fixed, she said, her scientific training providing framework for understanding phenomena that transcended conventional categories while remaining subject to systematic investigation. A place where we can test different approaches to self-definition without being permanently committed to any particular version of ourselves. Stranger nodded with approval that suggested Elena had grasped something essential about the nature of their destination. The City of Lost Names serves as a laboratory for consciousness development, providing safe space for exploring aspects of identity that might be too destabilizing to investigate within the context of ordinary social relationships and professional obligations. Maya felt her consciousness harmonizer beginning to resonate with frequencies that seemed to emerge from the beyond the archway. Not melodies she could identify or categorize, but musical patterns that suggested forms of harmony she had never learned to create with conventional instruments or traditional approaches to composition. I can hear music coming from in there, she said, though she realized as she spoke that hearing was not quite accurate. The music existed at the intersection of sound and consciousness, audible to awareness that had developed the capacity to perceive patterns that operated according to laws that transcended ordinary acoustic physics. Joe felt his intentional nourishment facilitators begin to warm in response to the needs that existed beyond the archway, hungers that transcended physical sustenance, thirst that could only be satisfied by forms of nourishment that addressed aspects of human nature that most people never learn to recognize or feed. There are people in there who need what I'm learning to provide, he realized, though he couldn't have explained how he knew this or what specific forms of service would be required once they crossed the threshold into territories where conventional approaches to nourishment might prove inadequate to address the kind of needs they would encounter. Leo watched his multidimensional creative manifestation tools beginning to generate artworks that seemed designated to document experiences he had not yet had, creating visual records of transformations that were somehow inevitable once they committed to crossing the threshold that lay before them. The art is showing me what we're about to become, he said, studying three-dimensional sketches that captured qualities of being that couldn't quite identify, but somehow recognize as authentic expressions of potentials that existed within him, but never found adequate outlet through his previous creative work. Tariq felt his consciousness integration humor facilitators producing laughter that seemed to emerge from sources of joy he had never learned to access through conventional approaches to comedy. Mirth that arose not from cleverness or social observation, but from recognition of cosmic relationships that revealed the fundamental absurdity and beauty of existence itself. "I'm laughing at jokes I don't understand yet," he said, though the laughter felt completely authentic, as if some part of his consciousness was already participating in experiences that his rational mind had not yet learned to comprehend or integrate. The market of unnamed possibilities. As they passed through the archway and entered the city of lost names proper, they found themselves in a marketplace that operated according to principles of exchange they had never encountered in conventional commercial environments. Stalls and booths lined narrow streets that curved and branched in patterns that seemed designed to facilitate discovery rather than efficient navigation. And vendors offered goods and services that could only be described through direct experience rather than categorical designation. My approach to stall where musical instruments were displayed without labels or identifying characteristics. String instruments that weren't quite violins, wind instruments that didn't conform to standard classifications, percussion devices that created sounds which had never been assigned to particular musical traditions or cultural contexts. When she picked up what appeared to be a hybrid between a violin and something else entirely, music emerged that belonged to no tradition that she could name, but felt absolutely authentic to aspects of her musical creativity that had never found expression through conventional instruments. The vendor, a woman whose age seemed to fluctuate between youthful and ancient, depending on the angle from which she was observed, smiled with recognition that transcended the need for verbal communication. "Play what you hear," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Maya's consciousness harmonize or resonate in sympathy, "not what you've been taught to produce." Joe discovered a section of the market where forms of nourishment were offered that challenged every assumption he had developed about the relationship between food and sustenance. Vendors provided not just substances that could feed bodies, but offerings that could nourish aspects of human nature that he had never learned to recognize. Emotional hunger, spiritual thirst, psychological needs that could only be satisfied through approaches to service that transcended conventional understanding of what nourishment could mean. One vendor, a man whose hands seemed to be made of crystallized intention, offered Joe substances that appeared to be familiar food, but created effects that went far beyond physical nutrition. "Taste what people actually need," he suggested, "not what they think they want." Elena found herself in a section of the market dedicated to investigative instruments that operated according to principles she'd never encountered in a conventional scientific research. Devices that could measure the relationship between questions and answers, tools that could detect patterns of meaning that existed below the threshold of ordinary perception, instruments that could only study the dynamics of identity itself, how names and categories shape the phenomena that they were supposed to neutrally describe. A vendor whose thoughts seemed to be visible as geometric patterns dancing around her head offered Elena access to methodologies that could investigate consciousness without reducing it to mechanical processes. "Study what cannot be separated from the act of studying it," she advised, "and learn to include yourself as a conscious variable in every experiment you conduct." Leo discovered artistic materials that could and tools that defied every conventional category of creative medium that he had ever encountered. Substances that might have been paint or clay or light itself, implements that Could have been brushes or sculpting tools or something that transcended these designations entirely. Surfaces that might have been canvases or stages or three-dimensional spaces where creation could occur according to principles that had never been codified in any artistic tradition. A vendor whose every gesture created beauty in the space around him offered Leo access to creative approaches that transcended the boundaries between different artistic media. Make art that exists before categories, he suggested, and let the categories emerge from what you create rather than constraining what you create to fit existing categories. Tariq found comedy situations and humorous scenarios that seemed designed to evoke forms of laughter that existed at the intersection of multiple emotional states. Humor that emerged from sources deeper than clever wordplay or observational comedy. Laughter that could heal and connect and transform without deepening or without depending on any particular comedic methodology or performance strategy. A vendor whose laughter created ripples of healing throughout the marketplace offered Tariq access to some forms of humor that transcended entertainment and approached the realm of medicine. Find what's funny about being human, he advised. Not what's funny about other people being human in ways that make you feel superior to them. The fountain of identity. At the heart of the marketplace stood a fountain that seemed to have been carved from crystallized moonlight, its basin filled with water that reflected not faces, but intentions, not physical appearances, but qualities of consciousness that usually remained invisible to ordinary perception. Around the fountain's edge, 5 alcoves had been carved, each one designed to hold objects of particular significance to consciousness development work. The stranger approached the fountain with the careful attention of someone who understood its function and significance with the larger context of their consciousness development journey. This fountain, he explained, serves as an interface between named and unnamed aspects of identity. By placing your tokens in these alcoves and speaking aloud the hidden names you have carried in silence, you create conditions where your suppressed aspects of your identity can emerge into conscious recognition. Lady Amara distributed small vessels made of what appeared to be crystallized attention, each one calibrated to resonate with the specific consciousness frequencies of individual members of their group. These vessels will hold the unnamed aspects of yourselves that you're ready to reclaim, she explained, but only after you have demonstrated your willingness to release the named aspects that have been constraining your development. Maya felt her consciousness harmonizer beginning to vibrate with frequencies that seemed to call forth responses from the depths of her being that she had never learned to access through conventional approaches to musical development. As she placed her device in the first alcove, she felt compelled to speak words that emerged from sources within her consciousness that she had never learned to trust or acknowledge. I have hidden my capacity to create music that heals not just individuals but communities, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the fountain's water respond with patterns of light and movement that seemed to dance in rhythm with her confession. I've been afraid to offer songs that could change people's lives because I was afraid of the responsibility that would come with possessing such power. As she spoke, letters began to form in the water on the water's surface, spelling out a name that she recognized immediately as belonging to her, but had never allowed herself to claim. Cantica, the one whose songs carry healing to all who listen with open hearts. Joe approached the second alcove with his intentional nourishment facilitators, feeling drawn to confess aspects of his service capabilities that he had kept hidden from himself out of fear of acknowledging them would create expectations that he might not be able to fulfill. I have hidden my ability to provide nourishment that feeds not just bodies but souls, he said, his words creating ripples in the fountain's surfaces that seemed to carry nutrients into dimensions he couldn't name, but could somehow sense. I've been afraid to offer the kind of service that could truly satisfy human hunger because I was afraid I might not have enough to give. Letters formed in the water, spelling communaris, the one whose service creates communion between all who partake of what he offers. Elena placed her consciousness matter interface detector in the third alcove, feeling ready to acknowledge aspects of her investigative capabilities that she had suppressed because they didn't conform to the methodological constraints of conventional academic research. I have hidden my capacity to ask questions that reveal rather than solve mysteries, she said, watching the fountain respond to her confession with patterns of inquiry that seem to extend infinitely inward toward questions that generate more questions rather than providing definitive answers. I have been afraid to pursue investigations that might lead me into territories where scientific method becomes indistinguishable from spiritual practice. The water spelled Quirintitia, the one whose questions open doorways to understanding that transcends the boundaries of any single discipline or methodology. Leo set his multidimensional creative manifestation tools in the fourth alcove, ready to acknowledge artistic capabilities that he had kept hidden because they challenged conventional definitions of what art was supposed to accomplish and how creative expression was supposed to function within social contexts. I have hidden my ability to create art that doesn't just represent reality, but participates in its ongoing creation, he said, watching his confession generate visual effects in the fountain's water that seemed to paint themselves according to principles of beauty that had never been codified in any aesthetic tradition. I have been afraid to make artworks that could change how people perceive existence because I was afraid of being dismissed as pretentious or delusional. Letters formed spelling Veridica, one whose art reveals truths that cannot be spoken, but must be seen to be understood. Tariq placed his consciousness integration humor facilitators in the fifth alcove, prepared to acknowledge aspects of his comedic capabilities that he had suppressed because they had operated at levels of healing and transformation that transcended entertainment and approached the realm of therapeutic intervention. I have hidden my capacity to generate laughter that doesn't just amuse people but transforms their relationship to their own suffering, he said, his confession creating waves of joy in the fountain's water that seemed to carry healing properties into every corner of the marketplace. I have been afraid to use humor as medicine because I was afraid people would stop laughing if they realized I was trying to heal them rather than just entertain them. The water spelled Jocondus, one whose laughter transforms pain into joy and separation into connection. The Keeper's Paradox. As the five hidden names materialized in the fountain's water, a figure emerged from the shadows that seemed to exist in the spaces between the marketplace's physical structures. Not darkness in the absence of light, but presence that existed in dimensions perpendicular to ordinary three-dimensional space. The figure wore robes that seemed to be woven from the essence of paradox itself, garments that were simultaneously transparent and opaque, ancient and contemporary, simple and infinitely complex. This was the keeper of the paradox, the garden of the threshold between named and unnamed aspects of identity, The guide who could facilitate the kind of transformation that required releasing attachment to familiar self-definitions in order to access more authentic forms of self-expression. "You have spoken your hidden names," the keeper said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the entire marketplace resonate with recognition and anticipation. "And in doing so, you have made visible aspects of yourself that have been waiting for conscious acknowledgement. But speaking hidden names is only the first stage of reclaiming them. To truly embody these aspects of your identity, you must release your attachment to those tokens that have been serving as your external reminders of your development." He gestured toward the alcoves where their consciousness enhancement instruments rested, each one glowing with light that reflected the hidden names they had just acknowledged. "The paradox that you must navigate is this: to carry your true names within you, you must surrender the external objects that have been helping you remember who you are. Only by releasing your dependence on these tools can you discover that their essential functions have been integrated into your consciousness itself." Maya felt a flutter of panic at the thought of surrendering her consciousness harmonizer, the instrument that had become so central to her musical development and her growing understanding of how sound could serve healing purposes. But as she studied the device resting in its alcove, she began to recognize that its most important functions had indeed been internalized through months of practice and integration work. "The harmonizer taught me to hear frequencies that exist at the intersection of sound and consciousness," she realized, speaking her recognition aloud as she prepared to make the choice. The keeper was offering. "But those frequencies don't depend on any external instrument. They exist in relationship between my attention and the acoustic environments I encounter." Joe felt similar reluctance about releasing his intentional nourishment facilitators, tools that had become integral to his understanding of how service could transcend mechanical task completion and approach the realm of sacred offering. But he too began to recognize that the devices had been training instruments rather than permanent requirements for the kind of service that he was learning to provide. "The facilitators taught me to bring consciousness to every aspect of nourishment," he said, preparing to make his own choice about attachment and release. "But consciousness doesn't require any external tools. It only requires the willingness to fully be present for whatever service opportunities arise." Elena, Leo, and Tariq each worked through similar recognitions, understanding that their consciousness enhancement instruments had served as bridges between conventional approaches to their work and the integrated approaches they were now capable of sustaining without external support. The act of surrender. One by one, they approached the fountain and placed their hands on the tokens that rested in the alcoves, feeling the weight of choice that would determine whether they remained dependent on external tools for consciousness development or committed to trusting the internalized capabilities they had been developing through their work with these tools. Maya was the first to speak her choice aloud. "I release my attachment to Maya Celeste Nguyen and to the instruments that help me remember who I was becoming. I choose to embody Cantica, the one whose songs carry healing, trusting that this identity lives in my consciousness rather than any external designation or tool." As she spoke, she lifted her consciousness harmonizer from its alcove and gently lowered it to the fountain's water. The device dissolved, not into nothingness, but into patterns of light and sound that were absorbed into the water itself, becoming part of the fountain's capacity to facilitate similar transformations for future visitors. Joe followed. "I release my attachment to Joseph Randall Smith and to the tools that helped me learn what service could become. I choose to embody Communarius, the one whose offerings create communion, trusting that this capacity exists in my presence rather than in any external method or technique. His intentional nourishment facilitators dissolved in the fountain's water, becoming part of its capacity to nourish all who approached it with genuine need for sustenance that transcended physical requirements. Elena, Leo, and Tariq each made similar commitments, releasing their external instruments while claiming their true names as aspects of identity that existed within their consciousness rather than depending on external validation or technological support. The integration of true names. As the last of their consciousness enhancement instruments dissolved into the fountain's transformative waters, the 5 hidden names they had acknowledged began to rise from the water's surface as the three-dimensional forms of light that seemed to possess autonomous existence while remaining intimately connected to their individual consciousness. The stranger and Lady Amara approached the fountain with vessels that seemed designated to capture and concentrate the essential qualities represented by each of the manifested names. These lights, Lady Amara explained, represent the aspects of yourselves that you have reclaimed through your willingness to surrender dependence on external tools and designations. They will now become permanent parts of your consciousness, integrated so completely that you will never again need to doubt your capacity to access these qualities of being. One by one, they approached the fountain and allowed the light forms that corresponded to their true names to emerge with their consciousness. Feeling the integration occur at levels deeper than thought or emotion. Cellular changes that restructure their entire relationship to identity and capability. Maya felt Cantica emerge with her awareness, transforming not just her musical abilities, but her entire approach to sound, silence, and the healing potential that existed in every acoustic environment. Joe experienced Communarius, integrating with his consciousness, revolutionizing his understanding of service and nourishment in ways that would influence every interaction for the rest of his life. Elena, Leo, and Tariq underwent similar integrations, each one discovering that reclaiming their true names involved far more than acknowledging hidden aspects of their work. It required fundamental reorganization of their relationship to reality itself, changes that would influence every aspect of their future development and service. The return to named reality. As the integration process completed itself and they were prepared to leave the city of lost names and return to the conventional urban environment where names and categories served essential social functions, the keeper offered final guidance about navigating the paradox of carrying unnamed consciousness into named context. You now possess the capacity to function as your true names while living within social systems that require conventional designations for practical purposes. He explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided countless others through similar transitions. Your challenge will be to honor both aspects of your identity, the name selves that others need in order to relate to you, and the unnamed essences that represent your authentic capabilities and purposes. Lady Amara distributed small tokens that seemed to be made of crystallized memory, objects designed to help them remember their true names during times when the pressures of conventional social interaction might cause them to forget the transformations they had undergone. These tokens, she explained, will remind you that names are tools rather than truths, useful for communication and coordination, but never adequate to contain the full reality of who you are or what you're capable of becoming. The stranger led them back through the marketplace, which now appeared to be populated by vendors and customers who were all engaged in the ongoing work of balancing named and unnamed aspects of their identities. They could see how the market served as training ground for people learning to navigate the paradox of living authentically within social systems that required particular forms of performance and conformity. As they passed back through the archway that separated the city of lost names from the conventional urban landscape, they felt the transition occurring gradually rather than abruptly. The unnamed qualities that they had reclaimed remained fully accessible, but they also felt their conventional identities reorganizing themselves to accommodate and express these deeper aspects of their nature. The transformed return. Walking back through the familiar streets of Meridian Avenue in the early hours of morning, each carrying within themselves the integration of their true names while maintaining access to the conventional designations that would allow them to continue functioning within ordinary social context. They moved as fundamentally transformed beings who had learned to embody paradox rather than being trapped by it. Maya walked as someone who was simultaneously Maya Celeste Wynn, street musician, consciousness seeker, member of their awakening circle, and Cantica, the one whose songs carried healing to all who listened with open hearts. The two identities existed in perfect harmony, each one supporting and enhancing the other rather than creating internal conflict or confusion. Joe moved through the city as both Joseph Randall Smith, barista, service provider, friend, and companion in consciousness development, and Communarius, the one whose offerings created communion between all who partook of what he provided. His conventional identity became a vehicle for expressing his true name rather than a limitation that prevented its manifestation. Alina, Leo, and Tariq experienced similar integrations, discovering that their true names enhanced rather than replaced their conventional identities, providing deeper resources of purpose and capability that could be expressed through whatever social roles and professional functions they chose to maintain. As they reached their familiar rooftop gathering place and prepared to process the night's experiences together, they understood that they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They'd learned to embody the paradox of being simultaneously named and unnamed, socially designated and authentically free, conventionally functional and cosmically aligned. Conventionally functional and cosmically aligned. The city of lost names had taught them that identity was fluid rather than fixed, that true names existed within consciousness rather than on external labels. And the highest form of authenticity involved learning to express essential nature through whatever forms of service and creative expression best served the evolution of consciousness itself. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to test their integrated identities, to discover how their true names could manifest through conventional social interactions and professional activities. But tonight they rested in the satisfaction of knowing they had reclaimed aspects of themselves that had been waiting for conscious acknowledgement, and that these aspects would now inform every choice they made, every relationship they entered for the rest of their lives. The great work of consciousness development had entered a new phase, and they were ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.